action.
Okay.
Hold on a second. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to our NCARAI symposium today. If you have questions during the course of the talk, raise your hand and I'll try and find an opportune moment to interrupt our speaker. If you would like a copy of the slides, I'm just getting a copy now. And if you would like, you found it so fascinating, you want to binge watch it this weekend, I am recording it, so just send me an email. Or if you just you're not here at all and you want to binge watch it, you can send me an email. I'll be able to make the video accessible. So without further ado, let me hand off the center stage to Laura Hyatt to introduce our speaker.
Yes, I'm very pleased today to introduce Rao Kambhampati, who is a professor of computer science at Arizona State University, where he researches automated planning and decision-making, especially human-aware planning and AI. He is a fellow of the Association for Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the Association for Computing Machinery. And among other positions, he served as the president of AAAI, a trustee of the International Joint Conference for AI, so IJCAI, and was a founding board member of the Partnership on AI. And today he's going to talk to us about how we can use LLMs for automated planning without deluding ourselves in the process, which I am looking forward to hearing about. So without further ado, Rao, we are all looking forward to your talk, and thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you all for the invitation to speak here. I think it's particularly appropriate because a lot of the research that I'm actually going to be basing my talk on in my group has been funded in large part by ONR, Office of Naval Research, which is my favorite funding organization that allows for curiosity-driven research. And so I'm very happy to actually share some of the lessons that I learned in this particular piece of research on LLMs and their supposed reasoning abilities, with you guys, Naval Research Labs and NCARAI, as well as I guess maybe some of the ONR folks that might be there. Okay, so I'm not going to repeat my title, but it will become clear as to why that title in a second. Okay, so before starting, I guess, there's been you guys can see my slides, I assume. Yes?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Okay. Basically, there's, LLMs are pretty amazing. We'll be, I think I don't have to tell you that. And they've, sort of caught, public's imagination quite significantly. And then the interesting part is when our intuitions about what is possible and what's not possible gets pushed over, turned on its head, we start thinking everything is possible. So now there is also a lot of argument and sort of people saying that, LLMs actually are AI complete. That means they can, for example, also not just do retrieval, approximate retrieval, but they can also do reasoning. So this is this, Sam Altman saying, for some definition of reasoning, it can do some kind of reasoning. I'm from, intro to AI. I've intro to AI enough times, and that sounds like a very wishy-washy definition. What is some definition of reasoning and some kind of reasoning? I actually want to make it clearer to you that they don't do really reasoning. They do approximate retrieval, and sometimes that winds up being the correct answer, and sometimes it's not, and there are no guarantees. In general, the fact that they do approximate retrieval basically allows them to be a great idea generators for pretty much anything, including reasoning tasks. But the idea generator is not the same as a sound reasoner. Fermat came up with this great conjecture, but he didn't prove it. It was Andrew Wiles who spent 20 years of his life trying to actually prove it and completed the proof. So both of them are important. So the TLDR of the talk actually is that LLMs have enough amazing capabilities for us not to, and that those capabilities we can use, that we don't need to assume or give them unnecessary fake reasoning abilities that they don't actually have. That's what I'll try to convince you of. Even though I will try to, I mean, much of the talk is going to be somewhat provocative because I'm trying to stop some of the misimpressions that have kind of increased in the field. I do want to sort of assure you that all of this stuff is backed by papers that we have written that are available in archive. They're being reviewed as we speak. And so that's that. And before I go forward, I also want to say that, even though I'm talking about LLMs and reasoning capabilities, that's one of my current interests. But, one of the other big interests that I have actually is human AI interaction and explainable AI. And, there's a lot of work that we have done that has been supported by ONR. And that's, some of the students who have worked on that, as well as some of them who are working on this particular aspect too. And to say just one word about that work that I won't be describing here other than this one slide, is that when you have humans working with AI systems, you do not, basically we are stuck with right now having AI systems explaining their decisions mostly by saliency regions, that is pointing, and the humans giving advice by nodding or giving up and down, thumbs up, thumbs down kind of a thing, which is essentially what RLHF does. And we believe that's a very impoverished way for human AI interaction. And so most of our work is essentially saying that we need to go beyond nodding and pointing, and we want to widen the explainable and advisable interaction by essentially developing, organically developing a symbolic interface, because humans do speak in symbolic ways most of the time. So that's about that whole line of work. And, there are talks about that. If you're interested, talk to me about that later. So coming back to...
So, excuse me.
Yeah.
So we do have a question from Matthew. If you can take a moment to unmute yourself.
Hi, Professor. Sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted, before you moved on, when you talked about how LLMs are good idea generators, something that's been on my mind as well. Do you think that they have, can you just expand on that a bit? And if you think that this idea generation goes beyond linear interpolation in some sense of the training data and sort of novel concepts?
May I, let me just let the talk actually, there's a lot of talk in actually, fleshing that point out. So,
sure. Okay.
You'd be answering. Okay.
No
so
problem.
one other or is it no? Okay, I think now it's fine. Okay, fine. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, coming back to the main talk. Let's see. Coming back to the main talk. So I basically talked about Avenging Polanyi's Revenge. For some of you may not have heard of Polanyi. Polanyi is this polymath who basically was, complaining, turn of the century, that, science takes only explicit, focuses too much on explicit knowledge tasks, and they tend to ignore tacit knowledge tasks, many things that we do, but we don't know how we do, such as perception, such as manipulation. And we tend to focus more on things that we do and we know how we do, such as playing chess, playing Go, and so on. And he was complaining about that, and he called that a paradox of intelligence. And people in AI might have heard of it as a Moravec's paradox, because Hans Moravec made the same point much later. So in fact, the paradox that Polanyi was pointing out became a sort of a revenge by around 2013 timeframe, when essentially we went into this deep learning revolution, and there was this implicit assumption that nothing whatsoever should be given to the computer other than just raw data. So this is, Jeff Hinton essentially saying giving knowledge to the computer would be intelligent design. And who in science would like to be accused of doing intelligent design, given its connection to, evolution deniers. So that was basically where we were with the deep learning revolution. So much so that I actually wrote this Polanyi's Revenge and AI's New Romance with Tacit Knowledge, a piece for CACM a couple of years back, February 2021. And in fact, the point there was to actually bemoan the fact that even when the explicit knowledge is pretty easily available, people were forcing themselves to take pictures of it and then present it to ConvNet rather than use it as knowledge directly, because that was somehow seen as a unsexy thing to do. And that's not a particularly smart idea. So I was arguing at that time that, our robots need to have this, their serenity prayer is accept, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot learn, data to learn the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. This was 2021. The interesting thing is, within the last 2 years, or maybe even within the last 1.5 years, things have changed quite significantly. And this is a kind of a way of looking at what happened. LLMs, I would argue, are ironically avenging Polanyi's revenge. They're making a lot of changes to the AI research. For example, a lot of work in LLM-related work in AI has become essentially a sort of an ersatz natural science, poking LLMs to see whether they have different capabilities. At least, can you establish that they have these capabilities empirically? But more importantly, one of the things that's become clear is LLMs are sources of approximate knowledge on about everything. Any possible topic under the sun, they will give you some approximate answers. Sometimes you know the answer and you can actually say that what they said is actually correct, but they themselves don't have any guarantees about that. This actually brings back the good old-fashioned way of doing AI, except with a twist. So if you remember this picture, this was the old knowledge engineering approach. If you wanted to solve a problem, if you want to do mission planning, you'll go talk to mission planning experts. Human knowledge engineer goes, talks to human mission planning experts, gets their insights, writes them into some formal form, puts it into a knowledge base, and then essentially some reasoning system or expert system or something was actually working with this knowledge. This was the good old-fashioned AI that we would like to look down upon. If you think about this, I would argue that that whole yellow part, the first 3 pieces, have essentially been approximately automated by LLMs. So instead of having human knowledge engineers, you can just ask LLM, the knowledge about any domain, in fact, whether it's planning or planning knowledge, and that piece can actually then be used, and you can refine that knowledge as a model, and then you can actually do first principles reasoning from there. And that becomes a very useful way of using LLMs. And in fact, papers are being written on this without realizing that they're actually repeating good old-fashioned AI, except in a different, with a different twist. So this kind of becomes ironic, because we were saying if a single human happens to know a useful fact about how to solve the problem, you shouldn't take it from them, because that would be cheating. Whereas if an entire humanity writes down everything it knows on the web, for their own consumption, for their mutual consumption, and we have these systems trained on this entire knowledge, as obviously Ngram models, then using them is okay. In fact, people are actually using this sort of getting knowledge out of LLMs and then feeding it to downstream reasoning systems. So this actually becomes an interesting way of looking at LLMs. And in the context of that, I want to talk about whether actually what they can be used for in planning tasks. This talk is not really about the introduction to LLMs. I hope that most of you have thought about it, but these are the slides that I normally flash, that I tend to think of LLMs as n-gram models on steroids. You have heard of unigram models, bigram models. Think of ChatGPT as a 3001 gram model, which basically takes the past 3000 words in the context and tries to give and basically tries to predict the next word. So it learns, it basically learns a conditional probability table of the next word given the past 3000 words. Okay. If you think about it that way, the interesting thing, the one thing that I want you to remember is we were surprised at the fact that there are 176 billion parameters for ChatGPT, and of course much more for GPT-4. But really, you should be so happy that it's only 176 billion, because the number of rows in that previous, the number in the 3000 word context would be 50,000 power 3000. That's like infinity compared to 176 billion. So essentially, the transformers are really compressing this count table. And you know that compression is correlated with some kind of generalization in various times. And so and part of that compression involves internal abstraction and some sort of generalization. And while we don't know exactly what kind of generalization is occurring, we have noticed externally that they seem to have all these amazing capabilities. They can write essays, they can write poems, they can give convincing explanations which are not necessarily true. They can Also, I mean, I guess, if you are Microsoft, I believe apparently Microsoft people were extremely impressed that it could do TXZ code to produce a sketch of the unicorn. So that was considered like a huge spark of, AGI. Okay, so all these things, which they were not really, we didn't think that that's what they were doing. They were just supposedly, predicting the next word. But as they do this repeatedly, they seem to be giving pretty interesting results, empirically speaking. And as many of you have probably thought about, and I will repeat multiple times here, that if there is meaning in any of these conclusions, facts, humor, pathos, it is in our heads. There is no guarantee whatsoever from the LLM side that what they are producing is actually connected to the fact, connected to the world that we currently live in. They're extremely good at capturing the distribution of the plausible worlds. And so they can make movie scripts, but they would have a hard time actually answering what is true in the current world specifically. For that, I would suggest that you would still go back to Google. But then, all these competencies aside, there are some wild claims about their reasoning abilities. Some papers here, for example, in Eurips, will talk about they're all zero-shot planners, zero-shot reasoners. They can be used for all sorts of reasoning tasks. That, to me, suddenly started becoming interesting, because I'm not surprised that LLMs can provide interesting completions, but I was not willing to believe without empirically checking whether, in fact, they are able to do reasoning. And it turns out that the left side, the right side of thing is basically saying, that it's oftentimes hard to tell whether you are answering a question because you have done reasoning. You answer the question by reasoning, or you answer the question by, basically learning patterns. So, for example, if you're trying to predict whether a random SAT instance is actually solvable, if all you need to do is predicting that, most learning systems are more likely to learn the phase transition threshold rather than learn Davis-Putnam procedure. And so that's something that we want to see. I want to establish that's what is happening in the claims about planning. So now, of course, you might ask, why are NeurIPS, pretty darn impressive conference, why is it publishing LLMs are zero-shot reasoners papers? I try to argue in this talk, as well as in my papers, that in fact, the reviewers are also misguided. Unfortunately, that is possible. I, for example, think that astrologers are zero-shot predictors. My experience is that with chain of thought prompting, astrologers are quite amazing, but they don't still seem to allow astrology papers in Eurips. Hopefully, that might change. More seriously, I would argue that our poor intuitions about what I call approximate omniscience of LLMs, because they've been trained on everything that we have ever written on the web, and we really don't understand what's all on the web that we have actually put on the web. The lack of intuitions about that is actually the reason we tend to be very surprised and impressed at what LLMs are doing. So, for example, there is at least 600 gigabytes of text on the web that ChatGPT has been trained on, and you guys really, and none of us, have really a good idea as to, other than at a very high level, as to what are all the things that are in the training data. In particular, there are sites. I mean, if you remember when Google's PaLM system came out, people were extremely impressed that PaLM was able to explain a joke. That looks amazing. No, we didn't train it to explain a joke, and it's explaining a joke. Well, it turns out that there are many sites, websites, which actually explain jokes for the humor challenged. There are many websites that explain endings of movies. There are many websites that explain lyrics of songs. And there's all this stuff that's on the web. And since you don't know that it's actually on the web, you think that if it is giving what it's giving is an approximate completion, you tend to think maybe it is able to reason from first principles. In general, the last point in that slide, that busy slide, basically says memory reduces the need to reason from first principles, which is why you should not be surprised at how people do well in all these interviews. I know, for example, there's this famous question from Microsoft many years back that they would ask in their interview saying, why are manhole covers round? And the very first sucker who had to answer that question probably had to think from scratch and figure out why it has to be round and not any other shape. But now everybody has basically mucked up all the question banks. All standardized tests, including interviews, have standardized question banks. And at that point, essentially, it mostly becomes a retrieval rather than a reasoning issue. And so just because they gave the answer doesn't necessarily mean that they are reasoning. And it becomes harder and harder to distinguish reasoning versus recall just from the end product. I will distinguish it for you for planning, by actually showing diagonalization arguments. But, in general, it's not all that easy. And so you tend to think that I got the answer that I know is correct because I found it to be correct from a different perspective, from an external calculation. And so I'll give all the credit to the quote unquote system saying it's probably doing reasoning. Okay, so the other part here is that basically this word emergent abilities has become a big catchword in the area. And I tend to think that it's just a euphemism for what your LLM does when saying approximate retrieval sounds too unsexy. So actually just wherever you hear emergent retrieval, try to say approximate retrieval and it might still make sense. And in fact, that's more likely what they're doing. Coming back to planning, rest of the talk is about how LLMs can be used in planning, in what capabilities they have, etc. I want to point out that I had given like a 3-hour tutorial on planning, role of large language models in planning in the beginning of this summer in Prague and ICAPS, and that's available. To some extent, the rest of the talk is kind of draw some of the lessons from there as well as the work that we have done. And this is sort of the summary of the roles of LLMs in large language models in planning that I will walk you through. The very first on the top is the autonomous mode, where LLM is given a planning problem and it just gives the plan. And you're impressed that it can do reasoning and it's able to produce planning. Because by the way, planning is a form of reasoning. And so we are actually looking at LLM's reasoning capabilities in their ability to generate plans. So autonomous capabilities, and then that I'll try to show you that actually they don't have good autonomous generation capabilities. In fact, they have none, is what I will try to show you. And mostly what they do well is retrieving. And then I'll show you that, however, because they're good idea generators, they can be used in context of external planners and verifiers to do very faster planning. For example, in general, you could do things like LLM case-based reasoning or LLM hierarchical task network planning, for those of you who know case-based reasoning and hierarchical task network planning, where in the case-based reasoning, you don't need a case-based. LLM just sort of generates an approximate case based on your prompt, and then you try to improve it. You are either external solver or a human. So those are the top ones. And then more importantly, with respect to this avenging Polanyi's revenge angle, LLMs are a source of planning knowledge, and you can use them to tease out either PDL models or HTN models, hierarchical task network models, and then give them to your external planner. Somebody's mic seems to be open. Can they please mute it if they're not talking? Okay, so that's the LLMs as a source of planning knowledge. That's actually a very useful way to use them. They can be, as I mentioned in the new GoFi way, where essentially LLM becomes the kind of a knowledge engineer for you, and then you define what it is bringing out. And then finally, LLMs can be used as translators or assistants in planning. That's like the easiest way to use them. We actually done this like 2 years back. It's again become popular these days, but that's much less ambitious use of LLMs, but it can also be done that way for planning. Okay, so those are the roles, and I'm going to just walk you through them to give you a sense of what actually happens in each of the LLMs playing each of those roles. So can LLMs plan? It turns out that a while back I think 1.5 years back or something, when ChatGPT became when GPT-3 became available, not even ChatGPT, I started playing with it to see whether, in fact, it can solve simple toy problems in, automated planning, like Sussman anomaly, which is that particular problem of B on table, C on top of A, and you want A and B on C. And then, you describe the problem, and, this is the transcript of my interaction with, the LLM. And you'll see that it keeps making mistakes and I keep correcting it. And eventually at some point of time, I see that it got the correct plan. And I just sort of realized at that point that clearly they are not doing any reasoning. They're just letting me say, no, try again, here is the way you are wrong. And until I can see that they have come up with the correct plan. So the person who knows the correctness of the plan, the thing that knows the correctness of the plan in this interaction is me, not LLM. LLM was just generating ideas. So I tried to actually make that, I had asked my students to actually make this more concrete by looking at automatically generated random instances of the toy problems from international planning competition, including Blocks World, including various other domains that they use. So you describe the domain, you provide basically, you give the goal, and you ask the LLM to produce the plan, and you check the plan to see whether it's correct or not, because you do have the domain model. And if you do that, essentially you find that GPT-3 has close to 0% correctness in the plans it generates. This was from last summer, not this summer, but last summer. So we wrote this paper called Large Language Models Still Can't Plan. I frankly didn't believe that this would be surprising to anybody, but with LLMs, anything if you say they can't do becomes man bites dog, and anything you claim they can do becomes dog bites man. So the saying that LLMs can't do something becomes newsworthy. So not surprisingly, it was actually covered in some news articles and tech news articles. And people like Jan LeCun were saying, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Actually, they can't do planning and so on. Now that was last year, and of course then ChatGPT happened, and GPT-4 happened, and GPT-4, as you all know, has apparently AGI sparks. So I wanted to check whether the AGI sparks will help it solve the planning problems. So this time we were a lot more systematic. Basically, we considered all different possible configurations of prompting the LLM with the problem written in language, natural language, or in formal language, which may make a difference for humans, but actually doesn't make much of a difference for LLMs. And also whether you're giving examples in the context, in context learning, whether you're giving directly asking the answer, or are you giving some examples and saying, can you solve these new problems? So one shot versus zero shot versus multi-shot learning. And so we set this up, and we checked to see whether GPT-4 and Instruct GPT-3, which is out of ChatGPT, do they do well? It turns out GPT-3.5, which is ChatGPT, was basically doing 6.8% on these random problems. There are about 500 problems for each of the domains. For example, in the Blocks World 500 problems, it was doing about 6.8% correct. By GPT-4's case, it is actually doing 34.3%, which is kind of not bad. You would say that's kind of interesting. It increased from close to 0 to 34%. And so we also looked at other domains, Blocks World as well as logistics. And logistics actually, you'll notice that GPT-4 is not as impressive. It's like 14% and 7.5%, but still better than 0%. So you might say, if you're a LLM aficionado, you would say, look, that's pretty darn good for it. Okay, so just to give you a sense, and there are papers that you should look at more carefully. This is the kind of the way we give the prompts for the plan. So you'll actually provide the domain, you'll provide the problem statement, and you ask it to generate the plan. And the GPT-4, for example, will generate a response like this in the right-hand side red, and that would then be evaluated by an external verifier, because we know the domain model. We can verify whether or not the plan is correct, and then it is basically rated. Notice the humans are not taking part, because one of the things I'll point out is with the humans in the loop, there are all sorts of worries. Just like we tend to think astrology works, even though there's no real reason to believe it works. Humans tend to be kind of problematic in the way they evaluate these sorts of things. So it's all computerized. It's basically automated evaluation. One other issue is, you might say, maybe Blocks World is very hard. Maybe this is not what people are supposed to be doing. One of the funny things about LLMs is at the same time, people are arguing that they are superhuman, they are AGIs, and also that they shouldn't be asked to do things that an unwashed Turker on Amazon M Turk cannot do. So it's like a funny two-way argument. So we did try to look to see whether blocks world plans that we were looking at can be solved by poorly paid Amazon Turkers. This was done before, this was done last year and like the beginning of this year, when actually Turkers were actually solving the problems. These days, apparently Turkers are calling ChatGPT to answer these problems. That's a whole entire other problem. But this one shows that humans could actually solve the problems at a 78% accuracy. That means they're able to generate plans 78% of the time correctly. Compared to, that's much better than what GPT-4 is doing. Okay, but you might remember that GPT-4 was doing 34% in blocks world. That's not too bad. No, it's like 0 to 34%. Isn't that like a huge improvement, Rao? Like next year it will become 78%, and the year after that it might become 150%. This is an exponential improvement in correctness. So one question is, are LLMs actually retrieving based on the names, or are they reasoning? Because remember, I kept asking whether they're doing approximate retrieval or they're actually doing reasoning. And how do I prove in general whether or not your answer was backed up by reasoning, or you just happen to have seen the answer? So if you ask me a tough question and I right away answered it, and you ask me, Ra, how did you answer it? And I say, well, just before I came into the room, somebody told me you'll ask me this question, and here's the answer I'm supposed to say. And the moment I say that, you know that I'm not reasoning, I'm just retrieving, right? So the question is, how do I see whether LLMs like GPT-4 in blocks world, their 34% accuracy, is it really because they somehow became better at reasoning, or is it just that a better approximate retrieval? The way to check, it turns out, one of the things that we did here is notice that the retrieval part depends on common sense semantics of blocks world. And there's a lot of stuff written on blocks world on the web, it turns out. And so we converted the blocks world domain by obfuscating the names of the words. This is actually an old trick. The late Drew McDermott, when we started having international planning competition in 1998, essentially was worried whether people were doing domain independent or domain dependent planners. And so he basically tried to change the names of the predicates. And as you know, if you have any background at all in logic, and I know that NCARAI is full of people who do know logic, that changing the names doesn't change the semantics, because it's basically the domain remains the same. So we actually, instead of saying pick up block, unstack, and put down and stack, we made up these names: attack object, feast object from another object, succumb object, overcome object from another object. This is basically like English words that are sort of, obfuscating the meaning. And we also tried random words, instead of just, this, then it actually put random strings for the domains. And the point I want to make is, if you are actually able to do reasoning, the fact that you change the names shouldn't affect your reasoning capabilities at all. Just like, Shakespeare said, a rose by any other name smells just the same, just as sweet, and a blocks world domain by any other names of the objects is the same blocks world domain in terms of, actual plan correctness and so on. As it happens, the moment you do this, the old results were 34.3, but the time you get the mystery blocks world, they fall down precipitously, 2.6 and close to 0% in the case of randomized. And in the case of the words that I've shown, it's basically like 0.16%. So GPT-4 takes a dive the moment the names have been changed. This sort of, I would argue, gives credence to the argument that it's not really doing reasoning. It is indeed doing retrieval, some kind of an approximate retrieval. And that just, you happen to realize that in some cases, the answers were correct. 34% of the cases, the answers were correct for normal blocks world. But the moment the names are changed, it actually fails completely. And I should mention that for this mystery domain, the simplest intro AI planners will get 100% accuracy, because they don't care about the names at all. They can actually get 100% accuracy in all this. So it's LLMs which actually are dependent on the words, and they're taking a dive. Okay, so that's more information on the mystery domain. And so this was a big enough thing that in the middle of all this brouhaha about GPT-4 is going to go rogue and killing you all. So I said, look, if it's GPT-4 is coming at you menacingly, give it a planning problem to solve with the names changed, and it'll get stuck, and you'll be fine. You might be thinking, well, maybe there are some variations that will improve the ability of GPT-4 to solve the mystery problem, for example, or improve its accuracy. You could do state tracking. That means like you can actually give an idea as to how a plan is correct. So you actually tell it a plan is correct if the preconditions are true in the previous case, and then its effects will become true in the next state. So you describe the correctness criterion to the LLM and see if it's trying to improve it. And we did that for state tracking. We also did fine tuning. I'll tell you in a minute. But neither of them, the step-by-step plan generation, which is state tracking, it doesn't improve the performance at all. And in fact, you might be thinking, but I've heard that chain of thought prompting improves, and I will get to it in a minute. There is significant clever hands effect involved when people are doing it as against giving an automated prompt upfront, because people tend to give away the answer without realizing. So the state tracking example, the prompt looks like this. Again, I'm not expecting you to read this. You can look at the slides later or look at the papers. It actually explains, step by step how to make the, check the correctness of the plan. It helps humans, but obviously it doesn't help LLMs. In fact, their performance doesn't change at all. And then so this, you could call this close to chain of thought for planning, and it doesn't really change the improvement performance. So 34 became 35 for normal blocks world, and then for mystery it just became 2.6 to 8.8. It's not much of a difference. Okay. This other thing that people talk about is fine tuning. If you are giving a huge number of blocks world problems to LLM and its answers, will it then do better in blocks world? First question I have to you is, why do you want to do that? In fact, there was this parallel effort by Ejin Choi and her colleagues. That I gave a talk about this in AI2 2 weeks back. So they have a parallel effort trying to see if LLMs can do multi-digit multiplication. So they gave, for example, 1.3 trillion pairs of 3-digit multiplication and with the correct answers, and tried to check whether LLM does better multiplication. Its performance on 3-digit multiplication improves. Its performance on 4-digit multiplication falls down again. So it's actually not really, all fine-tuning does is converts a reasoning problem into a retrieval problem. And if you want to do that, that's fine. But as we have basically shown that fine-tuning for planning doesn't help all that much. Okay, so this is actually that paper that from which all of this stuff has been taken, and these are the students who worked on this, and that's a poster that we showed at ICML workshop on knowledge, logic, and reasoning in the era of LLMs. Okay, also, since we basically did our own work, but we wanted to see whether other people want to come up with a different approaches for checking LLM's capabilities on this benchmark. So we released a plan bench, which is an extensible benchmark that not only looks at plan generation, but also looks at cost optimal planning, plan verification, replanning, plan generalization, lots and lots of problems related to planning. We provided benchmark cases, and we provided baseline results with that we have, and other people can try to improve it. And in fact, already people have been using it on GitHub. I think about 50 or so people have taken this, and the original work that we have done last year has already been repeated by multiple people. At least 3 groups that I know of. And they found the exact same results. So it looks like I showed that LLMs can't plan. Many people sort of see that that's the case. Actually, Jan currently uses in his talks, one of the slides basically points out that large language models still can't plan, to show that LLMs can't do reasoning. Not only that, apparently it's an interesting enough thing that some people even made TikTok summaries of this work. And so if you don't like my long talk, you can listen to the TikToks. On the other hand, the literature is kind of full of claims about LLM's planning abilities, such as these kinds of papers. So why this divide? That's just as important. It's like, why is it that people are writing these papers? What are they missing that, that we are not able to get? So it turns out to do that, you need to understand what is involved in planning and what LLMs are actually capable of doing. Planning typically involves at least two pieces. One is planning knowledge, actions, preconditions, and effects, general recipes, old examples such as case libraries, and then plan generation and verification techniques, which is the reasoning part, interaction analysis, plan merging techniques, plan modification techniques. What LLMs are good at doing is the first part, the planning knowledge part. They can retrieve stuff, and that's important. Basically, that will actually give you an approximate model, but they're not good at doing interaction resolution. They can't do plan merging correctly unless any old concatenation of subplans works. Because of which LLMs wind up doing badly if, in fact, your domain contains any kind of interactions. So it's not surprising from this perspective that LLMs can do wedding plans at a high level, because there are lots and lots of wedding plans that have been written up on the web. But if you try to get married with that wedding plan, you're likely to have police come up, because you didn't take a license for something, or some other logistical considerations got violated because you did not. That plan doesn't ensure that the interactions have been taken care of. So am I saying this just to say this, or do I have proof for it? So actually, we did this, with this extra experiment where we looked at the same problems and we started relaxing the domain in that it has fewer and fewer interactions. So for example, first delete effects so that no action removes anything that other action might need. And similarly, then remove also the preconditions. That means every action can be applied whether or not the state has any specific preconditions as being satisfied. If you do that, the number of interactions will reduce. Pretty much any subplan for a goal can be connected with any other subplan. And you would see that in that case, LLMs actually do better, not surprisingly. So the green part is showing when they become better. You notice even there, so essentially relaxations improve compositionality via retrieval, because you can retrieve subplans and put together, and that will already work. But if there are interactions, that compositionality won't work. And that's what these pictures are showing here. The fact that there is still red, a considerable amount of red in this, tells you, the non-relaxed basically is the normal domains. There are to the right. And the delete and precondition relaxed is to the left in both the pictures. And you see that even in the left, there is still red left. That's because LLMs don't even actually they're not actually able to count. It's a well-known, limitation of LLMs. They don't do arithmetic well. So if in fact you have a bunch of goals, you need to make sure that each goal is supported by some action or other. And they can't even do that, because of which, in fact, even in these very weak conditions, they don't generate plans that are actually correct for those weak conditions. Okay, so then comes the question, if that is all true, then why are people trumpeting, why are some people claiming that LLMs are actually doing planning? And we looked at all these papers, and that was much of what my tutorial in ICAPS. Most cases where LLMs are claimed to generate executable plans, if you look at it closely, you'll notice that these are cases where LLMs are getting by with just essentially the first part, generate approximate recipes, or get the planning knowledge part, and they are not, and the interaction resolution part is either not done, and the domain you don't care about the interactions. At a high level, all wedding plans look alike. At a high level, all travel plans look alike. And then so you are ignoring the interactions, or you're pushing the interaction resolution down to the humans in the loop, who then have to actually correct the plans that they're being given. Okay, so this is essentially what is actually happening, and I'll give you some case studies, by naming some of the papers and showing that that's what they're doing. So, for example, some of the papers basically wind up getting approximate task reduction schemata from LLMs and then that doesn't necessarily mean that those task reduction schemas can be combined without interaction resolution. So, but you can be impressed that you already have a task reduction schema. And then people have been very impressed about this, that it actually can do some sort of top-down plan action reduction and so on. So LLM-HTN and LLM-CBR that I mentioned earlier, they kind of fall in these categories in the sense that essentially you are using LLMs to tease out HTNs or tease out cases, a case for the problem. So naming specific names, here are some papers that have been well cited in the literature about LLM's planning abilities, React, inner monologue, and tree of thoughts. And most of the planning problems that these works look at don't require interaction resolution. They actually depend on explicit external help or programming to handle the interactions. Those of you, the few of you who might actually be from the planning community, might understand that if you think of SHARP, which is Dana Nav's planner, it combines both declarative semantics and the procedural control into a high-level program. And to some extent, you can understand what tree of thoughts does, essentially as writing like a SHARP program with calls to LLMs, which is good, which is a great way to use LLMs. But don't tell me that LLMs are actually solving the planning problem. You are orchestrating LLMs, like the way you can orchestrate web service compositions. And anyway, this one is actually a funny story from New York Times from a couple of weeks back. Amazon is apparently having lots and lots of travel planning books that have been generated by ChatGPT that people are selling, and people who then buy these are finding that the plans look like travel plans, but they're completely useless because they actually miss all the interactions. You might go to a museum and find that you're supposed to have gotten a ticket somewhere else, and it doesn't tell you that, and you've wasted your time. Okay, so that's basically the way to understand why people are thinking LLMs can do planning, because essentially they don't realize this part that planning contains plan knowledge as well as the interaction resolution, which is the reasoning part. Now, if that means that if that is the case, then can I then improve the reasoning capabilities by actually connecting external solvers to LLMs? So if we allowed LLMs to interact with external planners and verifiers, that is this LLM-Modulo piece. That's a constructive way of using LLMs. We have done this. In particular, we can take the plan that LLM generates and give it to a model-based planner that, in our case, does local search, something called LPG. And it then essentially looks at the plan, looks at any interactions, and does local search to improve the plan and guarantee its correctness. And we show that if LPG starts with the LLM-generated plan, it actually tends to reach the correct plan faster than if it starts with some random seed, which is not a bad idea because basically LLM probably gave a reasonable idea as a starting point. This is, as I said, is a great way of thinking of case-based planning connection, because LLM is giving an approximate case and LPG is correcting that case. So think of this as LLM era case-based planning. Another interesting and more interesting idea is, imagine you don't have a planner, you just have a verifier. And so for all these domains, the IPC domains, we have VAL, which is a system that looks at the domain model and can take a plan and check whether or not the plan is correct. So what we do essentially is we let the LLM generate a plan, VAL checks the plan, checks if it is correct. If so, it's done. If not, it actually also can point out what pieces of the plan are incorrect. For example, this action's precondition is not satisfied, and give that as a back prompt, almost like a backtracking, back prompt back to the LLM. And this can go on for multiple iterations until VAL is happy that it got a plan that is correct. And if you do this, we actually show in the paper that within about 15 iterations with the VAL in the loop, LLMs are actually able to come up with plans that VAL's guarantees are correct. And also we have done experiments to show that at least in some cases, the fact that the prompt tells you what is wrong with the plan seems to be helping the approximate retrieval of the next candidate from LLMs. So this is a very constructive way of using back prompting. That also gets you into the point that LLMs can generate this plan that the humans can then decide in domains where there is no automated verifiers and humans have some idea of whether it's a good plan or a bad plan. They can use LLM as an idea generator, and they can check whether or not they're happy with the plan that it generates. And if they're happy, then they are essentially kicking it off and they are taking the blame. So they're kind of verifying that this is good enough. Okay. So we have done that, and there are some issues in this case, this usual automation bias that people tend to believe that what LLM says must be true. So they are not carefully looking at the plan. But modulo that, it actually does help at a certain level in terms of humans coming up with better plans with the LLM in the loop. Now, having said that, you might ask, then what if humans have like a back and forth dialogue with LLMs, back prompting them saying, this is you should do this, this plan is not enough, you have to do the following thing. And that back prompting has been what is called chain of thought prompting in the LLM literature. And unfortunately, the problem with that is humans are notorious in giving away the answer and thinking that the system actually solved the problem. So, those of you who know Clever Hands, this was a horse that could do arithmetic in the turn of the century in Germany and Austria. And, if you say 4 + 7, it will stomp its hoof like, 11 times. And it was doing very well. It was going around various places, showing its effectiveness, its arithmetic abilities, until a bunch of psychologists pointed out that what the horse is actually sensing is not arithmetic, but the stress level of its owner. And when the horse starts stomping, when it comes close to the correct answer, so it has already done 10 stomps, the owner is very tense, hoping that it will stop after the 11th one, and the horse just senses that. And so that is not what you would say a horse is doing arithmetic. Horse is sensing the stress of a person who knows the answer. So I actually find this meme that I made up particularly useful in making this point, that the impressive reasoning abilities of LLMs are very much dependent on the prompter actually knowing the answer. If you don't know the answer, then know the answer, then you have to ask yourself, why exactly are you asking the LLMs to solve the problem? Presumably at best because you are out of ideas and you're taking the LLM's idea and improving it, which is okay. But don't think that what LLM gave is actually the correct answer. So much so that this issue of chain of thought prompting and assuming that that sort of shows LLMs solve problems has become such an issue, such an annoying thing for me that the other day I made up paper called Forest of Jumbled Thoughts Prompting, an ultra general way to use LLMs for solving, planning, reasoning, world peace, and climate change tasks. And you would think that the title would give away that this is tongue in cheek, but yet many more people ask me for the actual paper on this than for the PDF of the paper showing that LLMs can't actually solve planning tasks. This is sort of tells you the zeitgeist. By the way, you should read this abstract. I think it's funny if you know the area. So, for example, that red line thing says, we prove by reduction to Rube Goldberg machines that Forest of Jumbled Thoughts prompting eventually makes LLM solve any problems for which prompting graduate students know the answer. And believe it or not, actually, that's actually happening, unfortunately, without explicit realization in some of the papers being written. So this was actually New York Times quoting me back in May as basically saying, if you don't know an answer to the question already, I wouldn't give that question to LLMs because if you don't know it, who is minding the shop? You have to be, somebody should be able to verify that it's correct. It turns out there's a lot more nuanced things that can be said about mechanized critiquing of LLM plans that I talk at length in the tutorial, but I'm running out of time, so I'm just flashing this slide and not going through the details. One of the things, actually, the last one there is, can LLMs verify their own plans? People sometimes can generate wrongly but verify better. But LLMs, there is no actual evidence that they are better verifiers than they are generators. However, we have done some work showing that if you are actually doing fine-tuning of two versions of the LLM, one as improving its generative ability, another to improve its verification ability. And if you remember that verification is a discriminative task and generating is a generative task, verification tends to be more sample efficient. And so for the same amount of training data, the verification abilities improve a little bit more, and that can actually improve. So you can have an LLM verifier improved this way, critiquing LLM generator. And we show that actually, in the case of GPT-2, it actually improves performance somewhat. So that's something that does make sense. LLMs for extracting planning knowledge is the one that I was mentioning, is the useful way of doing things. And there we have a paper essentially showing that you can prompt LLMs to provide the planning knowledge like the PDDL model, and then you essentially ask questions about actions, preconditions, and effects. And if you don't have that way, you don't have to write these preconditions and effects. And there's with this, essentially the human effort in writing the PDDL domain model is reduced, and then the humans spend time slightly refining the model to make it a little more correct. And you can also have specific syntax checkers and specific local checkers that improve the model too. And after that comes a model which then can be used by any model-based planner. And we have actually done this, and there's an entire paper showing how we do this. And this way, we are essentially using LLMs to construct world models and then refining them. And the preliminary results actually show that this improves, reduces the human effort and also can be used with model-based planners. I believe that's actually a very useful way to use LLMs for planning abilities. And then, so that's the paper on that, and that's the thing. One other point I want to make is there was a paper in ICML that we wrote last year showing that even if you have a not guaranteed correct symbolic model, a underlying RL system with a simulator can use that model and improve its efficiency quite significantly. And there in that work, we actually provided this approximate model by hand. LLMs are only too happy to give approximate models with no guarantees. And then if you have a deep RL system with a simulator in the loop, it actually improves its performance quite significantly. If you're following the RL literature, people are very worried because deep RL is now under siege because you now actually can do bigger steps because of this knowledge that you can get out of LLMs. So in fact, there's a paper called Code as Hierarchical Policies, not from us, but from a bunch of other people, that essentially is getting sort of approximate models, approximate knowledge, which then is used to run, a separate simulator. And they don't realize that that's what they're doing, but essentially, that's the best way to think of what is happening there. It turns out you can also use LLMs for human preferences where because they've been trained on the data that we put up. So if instead of asking humans, do you like this or do you like this other option, you can ask LLMs for that. And not surprisingly, they tend to be close to what humans, vanilla humans might have said. And so there's a paper that we have on that. And finally, the last one is LLMs for format change. It's something that we have done actually 2 years back, even before I started looking at LLMs planning capabilities, because LLMs are amazingly good at changing format. And one useful thing from like a mission planning perspective is many of the procedures have been written in text for human consumption, but is there a way of automatically converting them into sort of PDL procedures or a formal language, procedures in a formal language? We actually did that and showed that GPT-3, before ChatGPT, was already better at doing this conversion than specialized methods about which people have written papers, including a paper that we wrote in 2018. So that's actually something that LLMs are good at. So they will provide these, translations. You can then, make corrections in the translations, and that can become like either, it's a kind of a way of thinking of knowledge extraction or a recipe extraction, which is basically what's happening with this translation. So the epilogue is basically, I gave you the summary of LLM roles in planning. I kind of walked you through autonomous, LLM-Modulo, LLMs as a source of planning knowledge, and LLMs as translators and assistants. And as I said, these all actually are in the papers that I've shown there. And then, these slides as to why, that planning involves both plan knowledge and the reasoning part, and LLMs actually might be just getting the planning knowledge and you are considering that to be reasoning is something worth keeping in mind. And also why people are confused as to what LLMs are doing is, basically they are not actually doing interaction resolution. And by picking up problems where interaction resolution can be ignored, they're thinking that retrieval is actually planning. And the last thing is that sequential decision making in the age of LLMs allows us to actually use LLMs to come up with approximate models and use that to run underlying simulators and so on. This is something that's a worthwhile thing to do because for a while, people have been worried about giving any useful knowledge to planners. Basically, deep reinforcement learning basically said, let's try to learn everything from pixel level. That's actually a silly idea. Now with LLMs, in fact, you have approximate symbolic models, and that can actually improve the RL performance quite significantly. And in general, I think that the big question is, if you have a doddering old uncle who has a ready answer to any in actually doing planning with guarantees. And it turns out that I've done some work a while back on what's called model light planning, which is dealing with the model-based planning when there are fewer guarantees about the correctness of the model. In that, actually ONR and Bezag supported. And I believe that sort of work is going to be quite relevant in leveraging LLM capabilities. This is the planning with incomplete models and LLMs. So this is the summary, and I'm going to stop with that summary slide, and also point out again that I have students who actually worked on all this stuff, and that the TLDR here is, I'm not trying to say LLMs are not good. They're great with amazing approximate retrieval abilities, and we don't have to ascribe fake reasoning and planning capabilities to them. And as I said, a lot of this work is actually funded by ONR, although that funding is ending. So if you like whatever I'm talking about and nice other funding opportunities from ONR, please do let me know. And I'm going to stop here with the summary. Thank you.
Wow, that was quite a fire hose of information in just an hour. So if I know it's 1 o'clock and people are welcome to stay or leave. There was, while you were talking, an interesting conversation back and forth in the chat.
Okay.
And Andrew and Matthew were doing most of the conversing. If one or both of you would like to unmute yourselves and maybe kind of state your points of view regarding the mystery block world experiment that you showed, that the speakers talked about. Oh, come on.
Sure. So, I mean, I think I agree with the professor. So I guess my, could I have another, would I be able to ask a
Sure.
related question?
Whatever question you have.
Whatever.
Sure. So, I mean, I have a couple of questions. So first, you mentioned at the beginning that there's some absurdly large table of probabilities that LLMs would have to be learning, like 50,000 to the 3,000 or something. Do you think the LLMs are able to approximate this by learning latent representations?
That's exactly what.
Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly what they're doing. That's exactly what they're doing. They are learning some abstractions. We don't quite know what those abstractions are,
right.
But we do see that, again, they're compressing a 50,000 power 3,000 into 176 billion parameters. That is a huge compression. And with every compression comes generalization that may or may not be well-founded generalization. But the fact that we seem to be liking some of the completions they give, especially in text tasks, etc., tells you that they're actually learning some kind of latent representations. The question is one of guarantees. I mean, again, it's not like they are producing plans that are like random strings. Okay, they are probably close in some sense compared to complete random sequence of actions. But they're just not correct. And if you want to do planning, we always knew, if you give a PDDL domain, you know that the plan in the end is just some sequence of actions from that domain, right? The question is which sequence. That's still a search problem. So they're very good at coming up with ideas. And sometimes those ideas may even be close to where the correct plan may be, but they don't know that. The LLMs don't know that. You, the verifier, either the human or the verifier, would have to find out, basically have to check.
Thank you. And then as a follow-up question, maybe just to pick your brain about the LLM mechanism as well, like the fact that an LLM is able to pluck out a single data point out of like the billions of data points to answer, why is a manhole cover round? I know that, I mean, deep learning has an issue with data imbalance, and it sort of overgeneralizes some. Do you think that the transformer attention mechanism helps it focus down on single data points to retrieve things like this?
That's actually a very interesting question. The answer to that is only coming out slowly. So in fact, yesterday there was a tweet thread by Jeremy Howard, and they basically have noticed that LLMs are actually able to memorize much faster than you would expect. Exactly sort of what you are guessing. and they actually provide some empirical validation to it. So if you, either you can find the tweet thread. It's not yet published paper, it's a tweet thread. And by the way, if you want to keep track of what's going on in AI, you do have to follow Twitter and Archive. Unfortunately, it's noisy, but you have to follow it. So I can send you that thread, but they are not actually written a paper. But there seem to be reasons to believe that. So it's like two things at the same time. On one hand, LLMs are non-veritical, right? They are not indexing and retrieving. They are not databases. They are n-gram models. And yet, given the size of the context they are taking, 3,000 word context, even for ChatGPT, is something on which we have like basically no intuitions. Okay. And so that the fact that they're learning at that level does apparently seem to have this advantage of coming close to the right piece, but without guarantees again, but coming close to the right piece. And so in general, you would think that for a learning system, you would have to repeat the same thing like 10,000 times before it actually makes sense to, it kind of, gets compiled into an n-gram completion. But that is one of the things that apparently may not be true for LLMs. And this is something that people are noticing already, but, it's actually becoming, it's actually also being shown. While we are at this, I do want to mention, since we're talking about LLMs, I hope everybody understands that the in-context learnings, people talk about this thing called in-context learning, which is essentially putting extra stuff in the prompt window, and that changes the completions. That's not learning at all. Essentially, LLMs have computed all the conditional probability tables for all possible last 3,000 word completions. And when you add more stuff to the window, you're just changing the last 3,000 words. There's already a pre-computed conditional probability table that's waiting for you. You just wind up using that. So there is actually no learning. It's like learning, quote unquote, a hugely conditional plan offline, and then execute it online based on what actually are the things that are happening in that, that you're telling your sensors are telling you about the world that you're in. And for LLM, its only sensor is its context window. So it's not learning, it is basically just using which branch to use.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give people one more chance to ask a question. If you have a question, please raise your hand. And I hope George has a question. So George, please unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you, Professor. So I have a burning question. Did you use any LLM to plan for this lecture? Just
Not
kidding.
at all.
Sorry.
No, I actually,
no, you don't have to. You don't have to.
I mean, I in fact, funnily enough, I now feel compelled to have in my email signature. If you get an email from me, in my signature block, it says, "Not a single sentence in this, email has been generated by an LLM." I think
right.
LLM are like Viagra's. Some of us don't need it or tolerate it.
No, that was a tongue in cheek. My real question is, so for the Navy or DoD context in general, using approximate planning or anything approximate may not cut it in many contexts, just because you have conditions where something that is a little off could lead you to the lethal path or path
Yes.
to that's not desirable. So yeah, but that's the whole point. I mean, when you approximate, in some contexts, approximate will do it. Like if you're doing a wedding plan and something just doesn't quite add up, that's fine. But if you're planning for some military operation or whatever tactical context, so how do you solve this thing for LLMs? I mean, is it even solvable in general, like by just grounding them in reality in some way, just adding something in the loop as opposed to just simply hooking them with plugins?
So already, I mean, I hope you understood, you got the point that I already actually told you one way, which is having external verifiers in the loop. And these external verifiers can be learned from scratch, like connected to LLM, then you are still everything learned, except that DRL does, either is working directly in the world, and if it is non-ergodic, it's in big trouble, or it's working off of a simulator, in which case it winds up being the arbiter of truth. So this business of how can I use So the point that I keep making to lots of people is LLMs are not AI complete. That's okay. They don't have to be AI complete. Okay. So they're doing what they're doing well. AI already knows how to do reasoning as well as retrieval. And the retrieval part is now much better with LLMs. We have already other ideas such as RL, planning, verifiers, model-based planning for doing the reasoning part. And if you're saying, is there a way of combining it all together into one single learned system? Yes, possibly, but it's not just looking, it's not going to look like LLMs. One of the advantages of LLMs, in fact, one of the things that I didn't put here, which actually comes up in my tutorial, is what to make of things like LangChain, auto, and also auto prompt or auto LLM or whatever, I forget, auto GPT and LangChain. These are essentially orchestration services that people are orchestrating by making calls to LLMs. And so the orchestration service is ensuring that orchestration procedure is ensuring, some guarantees that the plan that goes out is correct. That's the kind of ideas that we have. If you're talking about how to actually change what is currently called LLM into something that is AI complete, my best guess right now is you can do it all definitely, but that won't look like LLM anymore, because one of the advantages of LLMs is they're very simple architecture. Very simple architecture. They are essentially n-gram models. Okay, you start putting everything else. In fact, this slide that I'm putting up, I don't know if you can see it, mechanized critiquing of LLM plans, which actually has the second bullet is feedback from the world. Some people think that somehow LLM getting with a LLM's advice being given to a robot, which then kind of essentially tries to do that in the real world or with a simulator, could actually kind of do this, improve the planning capabilities. But essentially all that means is that that's sort of like my back prompting approach, where essentially LLM gives a plan, the val tries to verify it. In my case, I'm model-based, so I'm actually verifying it at the model level. If you actually try to do it at the simulator, to me, simulators are just procedural models. And if you do it in the real world, there are always problems in the sense, when you do it in the real world, you can actually fail and you can get into a corner because it's of a non-ergodic world. And there, if you don't get into the non-ergodic situations, feedback from the world can still be useful as a back prompt. But remember, that world is very laconic. It doesn't tell you exactly why your plan is wrong. It just tells you, basically, you just get to see the current state, and see whether or not that has goals. And one of the funny things about LLMs, if you get a chance, look at that Sussman anomaly dialogue that I had with ChatGPT. It basically is ignorant and proud of it. So it actually will keep on saying that I have solved the problem when it hasn't solved the problem. And when it can actually see that it hasn't solved the problem, when it can actually see that the state that I asked it to achieve hasn't been achieved. And so when, world provides laconic feedback, that basically is the question of how the LLM is going to be able to take that and come up with a new plan, which again has to be checked by the world. If you're trying to do it in the direct world scenario, that would be fraught. So you still have to learn models of the world. So Jan, for example, Jan LeCun is kind of going around, arguing that the problem with LLMs is that they don't have world models. And couple of people like Josh Tenenbaum have basically been trying to see if, they've been trying to see if, in fact, learning something from language, from word models to world models, which is under what conditions is what you're trying to learn approximately from the word associations might have actual connections to the world models that you might learn from actual transition sequences. And these are open questions that are still, people are working on. But I think those are at least, they may not be the right winning approach, but at least they realize that LLM by itself cannot do reasoning. That's pretty much, if people get that, I'm happy, because they're useful, but they can't do it themselves. And they can be put in a bigger workflow with, verifiers or planners. And again, I do think, a part of the reason I wanted to agree to give this talk readily is because I go to the same PI meetings some of you go to, and you know, while there are many wise program managers, you know, there are also people who are essentially not completely sure and are essentially assuming that, you know, what LLM gives can actually be correct. And I think you're completely right that given there are no guarantees, trying to execute it in high stakes scenarios can be problematic. So for now, I would combine them with model-based approaches. And in future, we might find, you know, approaches that are the models are also learned directly. And, you know, the model-light planning stuff that I talked about, which is a little older, basically tried to do this like 10 years back.
So,
All right, thank you.
so my apologies up front for being the peanut gallery, but I do want to comment on George's question because we use approximations all the time. Most of physics is approximate. It approximately simulates the physical world. And, you know, we still have Newton's laws of motions, which they don't include quantum effects, but they've been useful for the past few centuries.
Yeah. So
I agree. Yes, sorry, go ahead.
But I think the point that Leslie is making is George Box's point that all models are wrong, some are useful. My point of usefulness of LLMs. So normal approximations, you have bounds to what is the maximum error that you can have under what conditions. And the reason we tend to use Newton's laws is because I haven't seen any car, even the Waymo car, going at speeds close to light speed. And so I'm pretty fine in using Newton's laws. I actually have guarantees that the error would be negligible. There are no such guarantees. All approximations are not created equal. There are no guarantees for LLM approximations. And that's the point that I was trying to make. It's not that it is guaranteed to be within an epsilon neighborhood of the correct solution. There is no such guarantee. And in general, I think this is the point about idea generation that somebody asked me in the very beginning. You know, we sometimes are stuck, right? We're trying to solve a problem, we're stuck. We don't know what is the next idea to try. And then some friend of ours is passing by, hey, I'm trying to do this, you know, do you have any idea? The friend has no skin in the game. They'll give an idea and you might actually find it useful, or you might try to, you know, because you have the domain knowledge, you might find it useful, or you might not find it useful. Either which way, you actually are in charge of making sure whether the idea is useful or not. And the usefulness of the idea depends not on the person who gave it, but the person who actually checked and, you know, used it. And, you know, I think that's a very, you know, if I don't have idea generators, I would be very unhappy. And as I think I mentioned in the very beginning, Fermat was very important. And Riemann is very important. Poincaré was very important because they could come up with conjectures. But so are Andrew Wiles and Gregory Perelman, who can actually take a conjecture and prove it from axioms, from first principles. And that's how we actually get civilization. That's how we get, you know, truth, right? So ideas which are not actually checked are not very useful. So, but idea generation is a useful activity.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think we've gone long enough and used up plenty of everybody's time, but it was a great talk. Appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time and making the effort to give a talk to our audience. And thank you everybody for joining. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And
I would just add that I am